Welcome back to another APUS History video lecture. This time we're going to be going over a national review for Unit 6. Unit 6 takes place basically from about 1876 up until about 1900. This is covering a lot of ground today. We're going to be talking about Western expansion. After the Civil War, we're also going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution. Now, the big thing I want you to take across that's so important about this unit is the development of a market economy. What do I mean by that? This has sort of been the dream going all the way back to the beginnings of American history with the Federalists. This is about creating a national economy that was going to connect up everything into a competitive marketplace. In order to do this, the United States needed to move out west into what used to be known as the Western frontier. It also meant urbanization. You need a lot of people moving into cities. We're going to go over the captains of industry: John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Leland Stanford. All of these guys, and there are different ways of looking at them. One way of looking at them is that they're captains of industry, meaning they organized industry. Another way is robber barons. They took advantage of the common daily worker. In fact, the latter one that we're talking about, the robber barons one, was kind of given its energy by a man named Samuel Clemens. You know him as Mark Twain. He called this time period the Gilded Age. Why? Well, that time period, to be of like gild, was to be some kind of like ornament that had a really shiny exterior, but if you broke off like the gold on the exterior, all it was clay underneath. And that's what he claimed this time period was. This time period looked really good on its outside, but if you look down deep, it was just a corrupt time period. And it eventually is going to lead up to, really importantly, the Progressive Age with all of its reforms. So what's my thesis? Always got to give a good thesis for these presentations. The Industrial Age was about creating a national market economy, and that led into both the progress of a centralized market as well as the need for reforms. Okay, so let's start off with Westward Expansion. After the Civil War was all done, and actually during the Civil War, there was a dream that the Republican Party had at the time, going back to the Federalists, of creating a national market economy. And the U.S. federal government started to make that happen with the homestead grants that incentivized people to move out to the West, and also grants for railroads to start building up transcontinental railroads that would connect up the entire country. Problem was there were Native American tribes that were sort of like in the way. So in order to deal with this, the U.S. federal government started moving these Native tribes out onto what they started making as reservation systems. There were a lot of these wars that took place. Probably the most famous are the Sioux Wars. This is where the different Lakota Indian tribes came into conflict with the U.S. federal government. And in the wars that took place, eventually the U.S. federal government was able to win, and they put these Native Americans onto a reservation called the Pine Ridge Reservation. When they were there, the policy that came up to deal with this was known as the Dawes Allotment Act. The Dawes Allotment Act of the 1870s was an attempt to make the Native Americans like Americans. So Native Americans in their culture typically tended to be communal. They tended to be farming, and they tended to be groups that basically worked together around consensus building. The idea here was to make them more like Americans. So the idea was to put them into nuclear families, to have the father lead a strong patriarchal family, and to have their lands then be farmed as basically nuclear family units for the market. Now, at the same time, their land was kind of put up for sale. Part of the reason for calling it the Allotment Acts was that some of the land was allotted for natives and others of the land was sold off. So not only did this really not align with Native American culture, on top of that, the best land was taken away from them. And then on top of all of that, as the railroads went out west, there literally are pictures drawn of people as they're going through the railroads just leaning outside and shooting at bison and just destroying tons of bison. Why does that matter? The bison were a central part of Native American culture. In order to grow up in a Native American tribe at that time period, young men would go out and they would hunt down a bison. But when you made these railroad tracks, for some reasons the bison would not cross over them, so that isolated where the bison were, and then on top of that they were destroyed by people going out west. This eventually led into a movement led by a man named Wovoka. Wovoka taught to his people the ghost dance, which was meant to be a traditional dance. It would raise the ancestors to protect Native Americans. At one point, finally, the cavalry took all of these Lakota Indian, the Sioux, and put them into one area at the Pine Ridge Reservation at a place called Wounded Knee. And as they were putting them there, they were collecting their weapons, and one of the men, they demanded that he have his weapon. He wouldn't hand it over, and the reason why, it turned out later, was because he was deaf. He didn't understand what the directions were, and so at that point somebody opened fire, and by the time they were done, the cavalry killed over 100 Native Americans at this place. So the second big thing I want to talk about is the Southern exception. So the South really doesn't become industrial until after World War II, but there was an advocacy for that to happen. It was called the New South. There was a push to have industry and racial equality. However, we know the reality. The reality was a movement towards sharecropping, farming, which was then rented out to local poor white people and African Americans. That put huge debt onto African Americans and basically created a system of slavery all over again, this debt slavery. Also, they created a new racial hierarchy in which they used things like the poll tax and grandfather clause and literacy tests to make sure that African Americans were in a second-class citizenship. And then I just want to remind you again of the case in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, that says, hey, look, 14th Amendment says equal, but we can define that as separate but equal. That basically puts its stamp on the fact that we've moved back into a system of slavery. It's just debt slavery. Okay, up in the north, though, we do see the Industrial Revolution take place. Coal, back in the 1700s, moved Great Britain towards the Industrial Revolution. Now, finally, in the 1890s, America has moved in that direction as well. Coal was used up in the northeast. Also in the Ohio River Valley. Remember, that used to be really important at the beginning of the country for irrigation. It's now important again, but for a different reason. All those rivers produce tons of minerals, and those minerals could be used then to fuse down into steel. That steel then was used to create the railroad system. But there was a problem at this time period in the marketplace, and that was a problem of chaos. So much competition going on, there was no centralized system. So arose the captains of industry who, in their minds, centralized these systems. So we'd call this a monopolistic system that has a negative connotation to it. John Rockefeller would say that that's not negative. He would say that what he did was he centralized oil. He created the horizontal integration. Remember, that's where basically he bought up all the industries that competed with him and then provided organization to them. Andrew Carnegie did vertical integration. Remember, that's basically you buy up all the things that it makes to make the product. And in his case, that was steel. And J.P. Morgan, he basically organized the banking industry by putting his guys on each one of the board of directors of each one of the different banks and then organized them. In the end, they were trying to solve a major problem that's going to become important for us for the next unit, and that is overproduction. Overproduction, again, is that idea that people have bought up so much stuff that they really don't need to buy anything more, and that means that your economy starts to slow down, and you don't want that to happen because that's going to be called deflation, where basically people are no longer buying the products that you're producing. Those products then get stored on shelves, and now all of a sudden you don't want to make anything more, so you don't hire people, and that just gets you into a cycle going downwards. So overproduction is going to force these guys to look elsewhere for new markets, especially Southeast Asia. Now, that's the perspective of the captive industry. What's the perspective of the common laborer? So up in the Northeast, there was an attraction of new immigrants. Remember, new immigrants in the 1870s meant people from South Europe, Eastern Europe, and China. As these people began coming in, they faced whole new problems. Problems like low wages. Remember, men worked 17 to 19 hours a week. There's your hours problem. And they only made $6 a week. Women, same amount of time, $3 a week. Children, as of early the age of 8, were making $1.50 per week. Plus, the working conditions were incredibly unsafe. Take, for example, the coal mines for children and the problem of black lung. But there was also the tenement apartments, where people lived in incredibly cramped spaces, sometimes 8 to 10 people in basically a one-room apartment with slumlords running over them. At that time period, the government ran by what was called laissez-faire, meaning we don't get involved. And so because of that, there really were no solutions to the problems at this time period. Now, some people tried to give solutions. For example, Jane Addams established the Hull Houses. These were a number of settlement houses that tried to teach immigrants English, that tried to give them job skills, and that protested along with them for changes in the government. Probably the most popular were unions. Unions were groups of workers who would band together under what was called collective bargaining, and they would try to use the strike as a way to force owners into giving them what they needed for hours and wages. There was the Knights of Labor that tried to integrate people as a whole, regardless of your skill or your race. There was the IWW, the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. They were the socialists and radicals of the union movement. And then there was Samuel Gompers with the American Federation of Labor, which is what most people tended towards at the time. He argued for what was called the bread and butter issues, basically provide for maximum working hours. It started off at 12 hours and then moved down to 8. Also provide a minimum wage and provide some basic worker conditions. So that's what happened in the cities. Out in the farmlands, there were a number of major movements. The most important that we want to remember is the populace. This was started up by a man named James Weaver, and eventually these ideas were represented by the Democratic Party under a man named William Jennings Bryan. The idea was to help farmers, you need to flood the economy with money. And they supported the idea of bimetallism, use both silver and gold in order to try to boost the overall economy and allow people to buy farming goods. Now, those were all the reform movements. However, there was another reform movement, it was a little bit darker reform movement called social Darwinism. The idea behind here, taking Charles Darwin's idea of evolution, there was a guy in Britain named Herbert Spencer who said, you know something, we can apply this idea of evolution to human beings. So natural evolution is supposed to be about species. He said, no, it's about human groups. There are certain groups that are simply superior than others because of genetic inheritances. And this is both for groups of people as well as for racial groups as well. Now this led into basically two different groups at this time period. People who believed in the gospel of wealth, the idea that rich people should be allowed to compete and rise to the top and just give philanthropy back. And the social gospel, the idea that we needed some kind of bigger reform movements that would solve for the problems that were happening in society. We needed to mix Christianity with certain more government interventionary movements. At the same time, for workers, there was also a fight between workers, and sometimes that led into some pretty xenophobic and nativist mindsets. For example, the Irish moving out to California and finding that the Chinese who had come to California at the time had pretty much finished the railroad. How did the Irish react to that under Dennis Kearney? You might remember they basically rioted in Chinese cities. They lynched Chinese people here in California, in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and eventually led up to the Chinese Exclusion Act, in which they said no more Chinese immigrants are going to be allowed. And remember, that led all the way up until the 1960s. Okay, what are our takeaways from this time period? It's a dense time period. There's so much going on here, but it's an exciting time period. I get kind of geeky and nerdy about it because it's pretty cool. Number one, Native Americans were moved out of the way for a new national market system with transcontinental railroads. Number two, the Industrial Revolution was fueled by steel and coal and the new management systems of the captains of industry. So horizontal integration, vertical integration, interlocking directorates. And number three, the effects on workers often made them turn to reform movements, like unions, to some extent radical movements. But in the end, the elites were able to define this period through this new notion of eugenics and social Darwinism, scientific and racial hierarchies. Okay, this is going to lead us into the next unit. It's going to deal with foreign policy and the reforms of the progressive movement. I'll see you guys in class.